I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Their sovereignty, in my view, has never been ceded, and we should pay our respects to them for their ongoing custodianship of the land.
I'm a Palestinian postgrad student here at the Sydney Medical School. I would like to welcome you all to our forum, where we hope to show you how academic freedom in Palestine is violated by Israel, with some real-life examples, with two students who are speaking today who've actually studied in Palestine. And we'll hopefully try to prove to you the importance of answering the Palestinian call for boycotts, divestment and sanctions against Israel. In particular, given we are an academic institution, the Palestinian call for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So as members of the international community of students and academics, we know the role universities play in either challenging or upholding inequality and apartheid. So it is in fact our duty to answer the Palestinian call and try to end Sydney University's links to colonialism, occupation and apartheid. Palestinian academics and students do not enjoy academic freedom, and we have two students here who are going to talk to you about that. So that leaves me to introduce the first speaker, who's Mohammed Abualrob, who studied in Palestine and is now a student at the University of New South Wales. Mohammed, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what it was like studying in Palestine?
My name is Mohammed Abualrob. I am from Jenin, Northwest Bank, and I studied at An-Najah National University in Nablus, which is like 45 kilometers away from my home city. Actually, the experience of going back and forth to university in Palestine is not an easy experience, and it is not a pleasant, especially when you have like an occupation that cuts the roads for you and settlers that threatening you during your trip back and forth to university. I was traveling almost every day from my home city to my university to do my bachelor's in law at An-Najah University. And it might be surprising for you to know that the first time we were allowed to have a law school in Palestine was in early 1990s, because that was denied by Israel, as they were trying to block the way before the Palestinians to understand the law, or particularly the international humanitarian law that would maybe challenge the Israeli policies and the occupation policies. And another thing that I wanted to let you know, apart from the ban over having schools of law in Palestine, that the universities in general were closed in Palestine for years. And students and staff were denied access to libraries, to resources, to labs, to everything. And they were delayed in their graduations for 4 years. And the universities were not allowed to admit students for their first degree for 4 years during the first Intifada. After the first Intifada, when the second Intifada erupted, the Israeli occupation did not close the universities, but they put many obstacles for the students and the academic staff to access the universities, which is much more worse than closing the university itself. During the trips to university, like, we had to change the transport method, whether it's a car or a bus, several times, because the roads were closed. We couldn't travel in one car or one bus to university. We could travel 5-10 kilometers. Then we would walk through the mountains for 5-10 minutes, then take another car or a bus, then walk again, and etc., etc. But at the end, we were forced to come to a way that we should go through a checkpoint or Israeli roadblock. There we had to strip almost before everyone, and we were going through a physical inspection where the soldiers come and check everything, use the detectors to inspect us, and let us wait for hours and hours in the way to the university. Actually, this practice was not kind of vain thing. it was meant to make the trip for university hard and let the students prefer to stay at home or even quit their university education because of the hardships people would have traveling back and forth to the university. I was lucky to have a chance to study abroad, so I skipped these hardships during my master's. But during my first degree, which is law, it was really hard to me and to many students, especially girls, to go to university. Me as a man or a guy who is maybe used to go through the mountains and stuff, helping parents with hard jobs, it was easy for me to do this critical mission, let's say. But for girls, it is really hard and humiliating. And they were going through this inspection, and you can imagine in a conservative Muslim Arab community how hard and how harmful it is for girls to go to the university under these conditions.
So I'll just introduce the next speaker now, who is Shamikh Badra, who studied in Palestine and is now taking up a scholarship with the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Sydney Uni. Shamikh, would you like to tell us how it was like studying in Palestine or in Gaza?
Thank you. Dear friends and comrades, I would like to thank Sydney staff for BDS for the invitation. I am truly honored to talk in this forum. As you know, the illegal siege on Gaza Strip has continued for 7th year. This is serious violation of international law and of fundamental human rights, and is considered a collective punishment against the civilians in Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip is an occupied territory according to the international law. International law states that civilians living under occupation must have full freedom of movement to travel and trade. They have the right to work, health, education, and adequate standard of living. I would like to summarize in my speech the Israeli violations of Palestinian academic freedom, access to education, and the students suffering from movement restrictions. First, right now, Israeli occupation prevents thousands of Palestinian students in Gaza Strip from pursuing higher education in nearby West Bank, part of the occupied Palestinian territories. These students are forced to pursue limited higher education options in Gaza. Second, the situation in Rafah crossing, Gaza gate to the world. Rafah border crossing, which is located in southern Gaza Strip, links Gaza with the outside world. Gaza population of 1.8 million can only use Cairo International Airport to fly to other countries. Thousands of people, including students and patients, as well as people who had visas and citizenships to other countries, have been stranded for months waiting for crossing to open. According to Gaza Ministry of Interior, the crossing was open for only 9 days since the start of 2014. Since the ousting of Egypt President Mohammed Morsi in July in 2013, Egyptian authorities closed the crossing until further notice of security reasons. After the Egyptian army started crackdown against militants in Sinai Desert, accusing Hamas-ruled Gaza of taking part in attacks against Egyptian forces. Being denied the right to freedom of movement for many years, the 1.8 million people who live in the 360 square kilometer strip are victims of Israelis' prolonged military occupation and political disagreements between the government representing the two main rival Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas. The siege surrounding Gaza has affected hundreds of university students. Some who are studying in the university outside of Strip have been unable to enroll for the new semester because of the closure of Rafah crossing. Allow me to talk about my experience. I received a scholarship to study at the Center of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney in March 2014. But I wasn't able to travel on time because I got a visa to Australia after first semester began. Moreover, Rafah crossing is closed most of the time. The only solution for me was delaying my study to second semester. That means I had to apply for another visa and pay another fee. I was forced to begin all the procedures of visa application again. In order to be able to study next semester on the 28th of July on time, I was forced to exploit a rare opportunity when Rafah crossing was open for 3 days. So I succeeded in traveling from Gaza to Cairo at the end of March. I arrived in Egypt after suffering and waiting for travel on the borders between Egypt and Gaza for 3 days. My journey was so difficult and dangerous from Gaza to Egypt. I succeeded crossing the border, Rafah crossing late at night. But the problem was I couldn't find a car to take me to Cairo because of curfew in Sinai Desert. Although the area was so dangerous and there were no cars to take me to Cairo, the army there ordered me to leave the area quickly. The situation was so dangerous because there was a military attack against bus carrying soldiers near Sheikh Zayed city in North Sinai Desert. An Egyptian officer was killed and 3 others were injured on this day. I waited for many hours on this night at this dangerous area on the borders until I found a nomad man who took me to his home beside the borders. I arrived in Cairo after I had crossed more than 50 military checkpoints. Now I feel, after the suffering, that I was released from the biggest jail in the world, Gaza. I was waiting in Egypt and Malaysia for 45 days in order to eventually arrive at Sydney University. Third, 4 years now, Gaza universities have not been able to organize academic conference with the counterparts in other countries, nor have they been able to send academics for research or training abroad. This policy seriously hampers efforts to develop and advance education, knowledge, and culture in Gaza Strip. Fourth, Israeli also restricts education by denying visa to foreign academics who wish to teach at Palestinian universities. Fifth, the economic blockade has obstructed the import of books, science, laboratory, and other educational equipment to Gaza, according to UNESCO. The lack of facilities, new information, and experiences has causes a marked deterioration of Gaza whole educational system. Sixth, there is also another group of students in Gaza who, due to the deterioration economic condition, cannot offer fees for local university. About 80% of Gaza population is aid dependent, according to OCHA. According to UNESCO, students are increasingly unable to pay tuition fees, resulting in dropouts and postponement of studies. The siege on Gaza has pushed some universities to take steps requiring students to register for a full schedule and to pay all fees without loans or scholarships. Seventh, according to UNESCO, many universities and colleges were damaged during the offensive, which ended in January 2009. As of March 2011, rebuilding has not been possible owing to embargo on building materials. Eighth, when young people graduate, they haven't almost no opportunity to find job in company or association. Some try to start their own business, but this cannot succeed in Gaza now because of the blockade. UN officials in the region have expressed concern that isolating youth in Gaza from border values and opportunities will backfire. Some 70% of university students surveyed by UNESCO reported they were not hopeful about the future, and almost the same number worried there will be another war. Ninth, lack of fuel to run the power plant and the power cut which reaches to 12 hours a day threaten all segments of life. From the beginning of this year, dozens of people, most of them children, lost their life, burned to death because of using primary alternative like candles and generators. Blackout prevents institutions providing needed educational services which depend on computers and internet. Moreover, students cannot continue their studies, which has a negative impact on their academic achievement. 10th, meanwhile, the internal of conflict between Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, is putting pressure on the education system due to the lack of communication between Gaza and West Bank ministries. After Palestinian political split in 2007, administrations of universities in Gaza prevented students practicing political activities and organizing elections on campuses. There were no students' elections in Gaza Strip since political split in 2007. According to UN estimates, the next generation in Gaza may be less educated, less professional, and perhaps more radical because an Israeli blockade has restricted educational and employment opportunities. Finally, we strongly urge our fellow university students all over the world to support all efforts aimed to boycotting Israeli academic institutions. 2. Promote students' union resolutions condemning Israeli violation of international law and human rights and endorsing BDS in any form. I deeply appreciate the principal stand Professor Stuart Rees and Professor Jack Lynch, who stand in solidarity with Palestinian people by boycotting Israeli academic institutions for their complicity in perpetrating Israeli illegal ministry occupation and apartheid system. I call upon you to support Palestinian administrative detainees who launched an open-ended hunger strike on April for 40 days, demanding an end to the use of arbitrary administration detention without a charge or trial. Over 120 administrative detainees are now hunger strike. I would like to leave you with a quote from Edward Said to remind us all why we are here today. Said said, "Why Palestine? Because it is a just cause, a noble ideal, a moral quest for equality and human rights." Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Shamikh and Mohammed. For me personally, I can't help but think how these stories change the way I think about academic freedom, to consider how academic freedom is actually your freedom of movement as well. It's something we often, like in Australia, don't realise. We think of academic freedom as our ability to study whatever we want to study and pursue our certain research agendas, but it can actually mean the way you travel and the way you access education in a real practical sense. I'd like to introduce now, probably needs no introduction, Emeritus Professor Stuart Rees, who is the Chair of the Sydney Peace Foundation and one of the founders of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here at the university. Stuart's travelled throughout Palestine and Israel and is a very active member of staff here at Sydney. And I thought I'd just ask you to tell us a little bit of why those issues to do with academic freedom in Palestine should matter to us here.
Look, there were 120 people in that theatre yesterday in the Union, and I imagine all of them would have taken for granted the sort of the implications of what Ben's just said, would have taken for granted freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom to write, freedom of association, freedom to at least try to obtain research grants, or sponsorship to travel overseas. Precisely the same freedoms which all Israeli academics would take for granted, including the professor from the Hebrew University who's on this campus somewhere. None of those freedoms, as you've just heard from Mohammed and Shamikh, are experienced by Palestinians. Quite the reverse. The Israeli institutions, and remember the BDS is about the boycott, divestment and sanctions against institutions, those institutions go out of their way to be part of the military apparatus. It's almost inseparable. The academia is almost inseparable from the military apparatus and therefore with the administration of justice in Israel. I won't go through the details of what Technion or Tel Aviv University or the Hebrew University of Jerusalem do, except to say, for example, that that something called the Dahiya doctrine, which is the oppressive, the overwhelming and disproportionate use of force to beat an enemy into submission, was proudly designed by staff from the Tel Aviv University. And not only is that do they work hard to maintain the occupation and maintain the abuses of human rights, but there's no evidence that the management of Israeli universities has ever protested when Palestinian universities have been bombed and closed. No evidence whatsoever. Towards the end of 2008, there was a very significant attempt by some brave and principled Israeli academics to mount a petition about the abuses of human rights of Palestinians, or the absence of academic freedom of their Palestinian colleagues. And they distributed that petition to 10,000 academics. Only 400, a little over 4%, applied in the affirmative. So the evidence seems to be that that Israeli academics remain oblivious of, indifferent to, couldn't care at all about what happens to their Palestinian colleagues next door. It is as though Macquarie University would be bombed and closed, and the privileged academics of Sydney University would carry on promoting and fostering their own careers, irrespective or indifferent to what was going on up the road. The question will also be, has been a threat that has been posed to us in CPACs many times. Why aren't you committed to dialogue? You're supposed to be about peace. Why don't you support the privileged exchange arrangements that we have with Israeli universities? The evidence is that these exchanges have enabled the Israeli government to maintain a pretense of normality. And under the smokescreen of so-called normality, which they like to promote to the world, there's a massive public relations machine in the Israeli government that tries to dramatize the virtues daily of the policies of the government of Israel. But under that attempt to pretend that all is normal, 700,000 people have been settled on Palestinian land since that policy occurred. Almost the same number, ironically, as were expelled from Palestine in 1948. I want to drift quickly, I'm only going to take a few minutes, into the question about what we really understand by academic freedom. Because I think that's central to, I'd like to think, to the consciousness of all the people who were in that auditorium yesterday, or who live privileged lives in all Australian universities. The question arises for me whether this is some individual freedom which you can cherish and which you can polish and consolidate and proudly add to your curriculum vitae, or whether it is a freedom only held to be and enjoyed collectively. Whether, in the words of the great political philosopher John Stuart Mill, political freedom / academic freedom is meant to be a form of humanity, the necessary condition of the civilized society, he called it. So the question is whether I can really have academic freedom if my colleague Mohammed here has no entitlement to movement or Shamikh either. The great Jewish professor from Columbia and the University of California at Berkeley, Judith Butler, says, of course, academic freedom has to be discussed, talked about, enjoyed, and promoted as a collective phenomenon. You can't have academic freedom if it's coupled to state violence, to ideological surveillance, and to the devastation of people's everyday lives. So can our academic freedom be enjoyed and promoted coexisting with the sort of conditions that Shamikh has just mentioned? Let me finish with a comment about the worldwide nature of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. People have said, well, we don't know much about it. When it matures, then we'll feel able to discuss it. It's been on the political agenda for 9 years. It was conceived by over 170 civil society organizations in Palestine in 2005. There's plenty of evidence that academic and trade union organizations in Spain, France, Germany, the UK, Ireland, increasingly across American and Canadian campuses in South Africa, and indeed among courageous and brave academics in Israel, that they support it. They support it, in Judith Butler's words, because that is a way to promote academic freedom. The other side of the coin is to hinder, if not to prevent, such freedoms. Of course, the absent voice, the absentee in all that is a country called Australia. It's a bit as though we're trying to imitate our voting record in the Security Council, even though Bob Carr, to his credit, managed to persuade Australia to take the courageous step of abstaining on the question of the status of Palestine in the UN. I want to finish with a reference to somebody who was a good friend, but who died last year at the age of 95. His name is Stefan Hessel. He was a Jew. He fought with de Gaulle in the Free French. He was captured by the Nazis, put in Buchenwald, sentenced to death, and one of the few people to escape. He then became one of the architects, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At the age of 91, he wrote a book called Indignez-vous, Be Outraged. It's probably one of the world's greatest bestsellers. There are three things that he said we should be outraged about. It's almost a blueprint for the Labour and Greens opposition in this country at this moment. First of all, he said, please, you mustn't be dominated by the market. You must avoid, in our terms, to have this notion that life should be about competitive federalism. Secondly, he said, you live on a precious planet. It's like a fragile life support system. You must protect it. You must challenge the flat earth society. But then he reminded us that he was a Jew, that he'd been a distinguished diplomat. He said he reserved his greatest sense of outrage for the Israelis' treatment of the Palestinians. And the thesis of that book is that to be outraged about injustice is to maintain connection with your humanity. The alternative, he said, is indifference. I think that's enough.